Good afternoon. I'm with Alex, who's sitting down, which is a rare occasion because usually he's up running around this. How many acres is this? Eight
It's a little
acres?
under 8, yeah,
About eight.
seven and three
And how many
quarters or
trees you
so.
have now?
I don't know. We're talking about in the ground, I guess. It was probably close to 1,000. Now it's a little less because we took out some of the temporary trees. So,
Fan.
but we have planted some new trees too. I don't know. It's in the hundreds
All right.
for sure.
And what tree are we sitting in front of?
This is a Moon Kun Si Thai variety.
Fantastic little mango.
Yeah.
Anyway, Alex recently took a trip to Washington, D.C. And what does that have to do with the mangoes? Why are we on this video if you went to D.C.?
Right. So DC is an odd place to go if you're thinking about mangoes, right?
They don't grow them
Especially
there,
in the
do they?
winter. No,
Yeah.
they don't. And I went in the month of December. Now, the reason that, one of the reasons that my wife and I went up there was because we wanted,
Barbecue.
or what's that?
Barbecue.
No, not in DC. I'm sure there is some there. In fact, I know there's some, but not any that I was interested in trying. Uh, but
He loves barbecue
um,
and food.
yeah, I do like food, don't I? But the main reason that we were going there is because there is an archive that is held by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the USDA, and this archive covers the plant introductory project whereby the USDA was trying to introduce tropical fruit, especially mango, to the United States towards the end of the 19th and the early part of the 20th centuries. So we're talking about the late 1800s and the early 1900s up until about the 20s, but primarily the 1890s, the aughts, and the teens. Okay, and I am particularly interested in the history of mangoes because every mango has its story, and the same for avocados and other fruits as well. And in fact, when I was in college, I wrote a lot of Wikipedia articles about mangoes in my spare time. And I always made a point to write a little bit about their history and who bred them and where they came from. I just happen to be interested in that sort of thing. Not everybody is, which is understandable. But amongst those who are, this material was quite fascinating. Um, and it kind of highlighted the efforts of these individuals who are so responsible for creating our mango culture here in Florida.
And we did a brief video on that uh, several months back, a little bit talking about a little bit of Florida's history with mangoes and why this is such a mango mecca of the world. That
Yeah,
between our immigration and between the people that the actual people and the that came here and to help develop mangoes. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
that's okay. So it actually took us a couple days to document this archive. It's contained in boxes. And I didn't even have time to read all this material. It was so vast. But fortunately, we were able to photograph most of the relevant material. I may have to make another trip back someday to document some of the rest of it. But at least the part of it that was applicable to mangoes and avocados, for the most part, we were able to cover. And one of the things that was really eye-opening about it was just how concentrated the effort was and how determined they were to introduce mangoes from other parts of the world to Florida to create an industry. And
Who was behind that when you say they? Was USDA or agricultural interests like big companies and corporations or private individuals who are just like passionate about the fruit?
some of it was private individuals. Okay, amongst them were several nurserymen that were located in South Florida, specifically in the West Palm Beach area. So we have a unique connection to that. Um, there was a man named Elbridge Gale. There was another couple of individuals named the Brailsford brothers. They took some of these early Indian mangoes, but they were those mangoes that were brought from India directly were brought by the USDA, and they first sent them to Washington, D.C., ironically enough, and then they sent them to these nurseries in South Florida to grow them. But these nurseries in South Florida had already begun growing mangoes. Okay, they just weren't growing Indian mangoes; they were growing seedling types from the Caribbean.
Quick question: when they sent, this is random. I'm just thinking, did they take a grafted tree, put it on a boat, and ship it over here? Because when you're talking 120 years ago, there's not really air travel. There's no UPS overnight service for a few scions. So, or did they take seeds, which then and then were they careful about mono and polyembryonic? I'm just kind of curious on.
The first mangoes that were introduced to the United States were seedlings that were brought from the Caribbean,
Yeah.
specifically Cuba. But this effort was actually grafted trees. They
Okay.
shipped grafted trees in containers on a boat, and from directly from India, and they were basically being grown in boxes
That's crazy because
of,
you got to
of
think
dirt.
about taking care of a tree on a boat
And
with
they did,
whatever
yeah,
weather. Yeah, and
they
I
did.
mean,
Actually, they arrived in pretty good shape.
and then
At
the
least
effort to just do that would be,
it took a lot of effort and it took a
yeah,
lot of planning, but they did it. And also back then, finding people in India that could graft was difficult. They were grafted through a method known as inarching. Well, they called it inarching. Really, what it was approach grafting. These grafts looked kind of rough. Okay, that it said so in the literature, but they were grafted trees,
right.
and they documented what they were. They tried to introduce initially in 1889. They arrived here in South Florida in November of 1889, I believe, which was kind of late, of course, in the year to be receiving them. But uh, they tried to introduce, I want to say, like half a dozen varieties. Amongst them were the Mulgoba, the Alfonso, which was sent to the Brailsford brothers, I believe, as well as a few other varieties. I think they tried to introduce the Pyrie, which we now know as the Bombay mango, or also called raspberry, and a few other varieties that are escaping my mind right now. Some of them pretty obscure and no longer propagated or talked about
That's what I
anymore.
was going to ask. Are any of them? I was going to use the word extinct, but
Yes, there
near
are. Yes,
extinct.
some of these are probably extinct cultivars that they tried to introduce, and they continued making efforts to introduce them. But that first attempt was made in the 1880s. Only one of the trees survived because we had horrible freezes in Florida back then. I mean, really terrible stuff. But one of them survived, and that was the one that was labeled as Mulgoba. Now, I'm quite confident that that tree was killed below the graft union. And what came back, and what we call Mulgoba in Florida, is in fact a rootstock from India, okay? Not a polyembryonic one, a monoembryonic fruit. But from that Mulgoba tree was born an industry here in South Florida. Now, later on, in the later 1890s and the early 1900s, the USDA made a more concentrated effort to introduce more of these varieties, and they tried dozens and dozens and dozens of varieties and cultivars from not just India, but French Indochina, um, from Latin America, other parts of the world. They brought all these different cultivars to see how they would perform in Florida's conditions. They brought some of them to Cuba, some to Puerto Rico, and they kept very good notes. I was really impressed by the breadth of some of these project reports, which were dozens and dozens of pages long. They contained photographs. They took a lot of photographs of these trees, and their performance and their bearing habits, and they kept good records on how they did, and it was really impressive stuff to me. And it's a lot of material that's going to take me a while to sort and go over, but I'm looking forward to it because it's more information that we can bring to people, and also helps us highlight some of these individuals. Some of them private individuals, some of them work for the USDA. David Fairchild is very well known. Obviously, everyone's heard of Fairchild Botanical Garden,
Mm-hmm.
Tropical Botanical Garden, down there in Miami, um, in the Coral Gables, Coconut Grove area. And he was very important in this effort. He worked for the USDA at that time, and but there was other very important individuals as well. I brought up Elbridge Gale locally here, but a good example of a private individual or private individuals that were involved were the Reasoner brothers over in Bradenton, on the west coast of Florida. They made a huge effort to import mangoes from India back there then in the late 19th century. Other really important individuals were Wilson Popenoe. who was very well known for avocados, but actually he took a number of trips to India where he documented a lot of the mango culture there and a lot of the varieties there.
And
Um,
did they do it for, say, personal interest of I just love the fruit, or did they do it for commercial interest of I love the fruit, but I think I can make a crop and expose parts of the U.S. to this?
so some of the private individuals absolutely saw an opportunity to create a business out of it. There were men like George Sellon, who was sort of like the Gary Zill or Lawrence Zill of his time. Um, he was a very impressive horticulturalist and nurseryman, and did a masterful job of propagating mangoes at a time when not many people were good at grafting them. And he was able to crank out thousands and thousands and thousands of them. He was the first really successful tropical fruit nurseryman in Florida, and Florida owes a lot to George Sellon for that. But amongst the USDA's kind of intention was to create a industry, right? To introduce
Yeah.
a new crop to the more tropical parts of the United States and its territories, and create an industry that was absent here, but give people, an alternative crop to grow other than citrus that could potentially thrive here. And in some ways, they were successful. Maybe not as much as they thought, but they certainly created an industry of sorts here, and the consequences of that were kind of reverberated about the world, because Florida mangoes are now grown throughout the world and in many tropical climates. So, in that sense, the effort was worthwhile and successful. So, but before having looked through all this, um, I knew a lot about the history of it, of course. But like I mentioned, these project reports, I was really impressed on how detailed they were, and how strong their efforts were at that time. So another important individual was Edward Simmons. Um, Sorry about that. Edward Simmons was the head of the USDA's plant introduction facility in Miami in the early 1900s. And of course, the Edward mango is named after him. The Simmons avocado is named after him, as well as the Simmons mango. And so Edward Simmons
So he's
was,
got two mangoes and an
he
avocado?
does, yes.
What?
Very important horticulturalist and researcher. And he was kind of in charge of the whole operation down there that the USDA had in Miami. Initially, it was a garden that was donated by Mary Brickell, and Mary Brickell had land that is now known as Brickell in Miami.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there used to be a tropical fruit farm there long time ago. We're talking about 120 something years ago. Eventually, they outgrew that space, and they temporarily moved to the Buena Vista area, which is like North Miami,
Mm-hmm.
up near like Little River and that section. And then eventually they were given land by the federal government, that was called Chapman Field. It was a World War I era airfield, and that is where the USDA's ARS, Agricultural Research Station, is to this day. But that was in the 1920s. So that was sort of the beginnings of the plant introduction effort down there in Miami. And it was run through the USDA. So
Are we gonna get a mango named after you,
after me,
or after your some that you get to bestow a name on?
maybe one day when I get serious about breeding mangoes, perhaps, or if I happen upon a seedling that's worthwhile, hopefully it's something good. But
What about a book? Will you
I would.
will you will you at some point possibly write? Uh, Actually, you could write volumes of books, series of
Yeah, I'm not
books
sure how.
between taking care of and managing and growing, and then the history and things of. But anyway, back to the
Yeah,
book.
I would like to someday. Now, yes, you're right. Like, it's a lot of topics and material, and I'm not so sure how many people would want to read something like that. There's probably some, I guess, but I would like to, publish something someday that people would find useful. And we'll see.
Amazon.
I need to have time to do that. I certainly have a lot of personal notes that I've taken over the years. But a book is another kind of effort, and maybe a little further along in my career, or at a point where I'm not working quite so much.
like we said, you're sitting down for the one of the few videos we've ever had you sitting down at,
Yeah, I
unless
guess
you're
so.
doing one of the 9 o'clock videos with Q&A with Paul.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So anyway, so maybe someday I'd certainly like to, but I'd have to define what kind of topics I'd like to write about. So
Yeah. Well, thank you for your knowledge and information, sharing what you learned up in DC in the archives.
yeah, and hopefully I'll be
And
able to talk more about that in the future as I kind of process it all. And hopefully there's people out there that are interested enough to learn about it. And I'd certainly like to honor the individuals who deserve a lot of credit for the industry and the culture that we get to enjoy today, and that we kind of take for granted. Like mangoes are almost at this point taken for granted here, but there was a time where they weren't so common, and they weren't so vast, and you didn't have so many options and,
well,
flavor groups and whatnot. So
one of the conversations we've had before, maybe on and off camera, I don't know if I have video of it, is the lack of, or the farmland that's all being lost. You talk about these large tracts of land that you mentioned in just a few minutes ago in Miami and wherever, and also here in West Palm and anywhere in between. And now it's easier for some of the families to sell them and sort of exit the program and let developers come in. And so we're losing some very valuable mango farmland because the best mangoes can only be grown in sort of a very limited space here within the US or even within Florida.
yeah, it's true.
Uh,
Certainly true of agriculture in general that there is the threat from losing the land to development that would otherwise be cultivated in some way, shape, or form. And here in South Florida, the better, I'll say, mango growing areas are really now some of the most developed areas, and you don't find too many places like this that are in those optimal zones. And there was a time when there was quite a few mango groves actually closer to the coast in southeast Florida. Down in Delray, obviously the Zills used to have a lot of land. You had James Minor, and you had the Garnett family. This is all kind of in the same zone, and now a lot of that is gone, or almost all of it's gone. And down in Miami, same story. You had families like the Mitchells and the Dupuis, and others who had vast tracts of land that's now all been developed or sold off or what have you. But on the other hand, on the other side of the coin, mango acreage has been expanding in the
yeah.
last 10 years in Florida, perhaps more than any other well known crop. And that's been impressive and good for the mango, I think. And our climate becoming more mild here has allowed people to grow mangoes in parts of Florida that we previously considered off limits to mangoes. So even though some of the perhaps more optimal territory has shrunk for sure, the areas that mangoes can be grown successfully has perhaps expanded into places that we didn't think about before. So there is still an opportunity for the mango to
Bar,
be grown on
barring next week's freeze.
a well, fortunately, it looks like that won't happen, at least down here.
Yeah,
Freezes are still going to be a threat to mangoes and
yeah.
their expansion in Florida. Okay,
But
there is a limit to how far north they can be grown in the long haul, but the climate has become a lot more agreeable to them, and that's great for people that are trying to grow them. So,
all right. Well, thank you. Hopefully, everybody learned something, and appreciate your time.
sure.
What time is it?